Good morning. Today we are going to start reading the book Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. I also wanted to share with you that we are going to be looking at our study guide questions, which come from the Lit Plan Teacher Pack published by Teacher's Pet Publications, which was put together by Mary B. Collins. I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due. So on your flash drive or on Schoology, you can find the study guide questions for each chapter. And let me just share those with you so you can see them at the same time. All right, so here we are. We see chapter 1 study guide questions. Each chapter is going to have about 10 questions. Some will be fewer, some will be more, depending on the length of the chapter. For chapter 1, it's mostly going to be an introduction into our characters, and there are many, many characters in this book to keep track of. So we will be looking at those together. I'm going to be pausing as I read to make sure that we understand these characters. So I'm going to be interrupting your reading a little bit. I encourage you to take notes on these as we are doing them. Write down the page number that the information was on and just sketch out some of the answers. However, those sketched out answers are not what you're going to turn into me. You must use complete sentences, and I expect to see at least one sentence, if not 2 to 3 for each answer. And then those typed out or written out answers need to then be submitted to Schoology, or take a picture of what you wrote and send it to me on Remind so that you can get credit for those. Going forward, these are going to count towards your grade, so please make sure that you're completing all assignments. So in chapter 1, let's take a look at the questions before we begin to read. We see question 1, which says, describe Ellen, and question 2, identify Jethro. So although we see 2 different verbs there as far as what it's asking us to do, they really are still asking the same question. Describe, tell me what Ellen is like. Identify, who is Jethro? What is he like as well? So the more details and information you can give, the better. Question 3 asks, what kinds of things were troubling the adult world on that April morning? And that is a very specific answer. You are going to need to go find it exactly where it is in the book. I don't want you just making up random ideas. Question 4 asks, identify Jenny. And then also, who is Shadrach Yale? So the same identify and who is are similar type questions. Question 6, how did Tom and Eb feel about the prospects of war? So prospects of war, the fact that it might be coming. So we're at the very beginning. The Civil War has not officially broken out yet, but they're talking about that possibility that war is going to be coming. So we want to know, how do Tom and Eb feel? It's not having us identify who those particular characters are just yet, but you are going to want to know who they are. Number 7 asks, what happened to Jethro's sister Mary? 8, to whom did Jethro compare his father and why? Make sure that you answer both parts. 9, who was Nancy? I'm not sure why that's past tense. 10, identify Bill, and 11, identify Will Scram. One thing I did forget to mention as far as our questions go is most often I would request that you start out the question by rephrasing that into a sentence. That's kind of tricky when you have a question like describe Ellen, but you should start your sentence then with Ellen. Ellen is, and then go on and explain. Whereas when we see number 3, what kinds of things were troubling the adult world on that April morning, you're going to drop the question word. The things that were troubling the adult world on that April morning were, and provide that long list that I mentioned, separated by commas, in your answer. So those are the questions. I'm not going to leave them up for you to look at, so hopefully you have your version of those questions, although we'll be popping back and forth to them. I will mention that today we probably will not read all of chapter 1. I'm going to try to keep the lessons to about half an hour. And then with the last half an hour, or I'm sorry, when the half an hour is over, I would expect that you take some time to write out your answers using complete sentences, whether you're typing those answers or writing them out on paper. And now we are going to start reading the book. So let me open that up. And it should pick up right where we left off yesterday, where we were looking at the copyright. We're going to turn and we're going to start chapter 1. If you have your book handy, I would encourage you to pull out your book, follow along in your book with me, and don't feel the need to look at a screen. If you don't have your book, then you can certainly look at my screen. You don't need to look at me. That's the way this format seems to work. There's a little picture of me up there. But we're going to read through the chapter. So we see right off the bat, the very first word, Ellen. Here's our note. We're going to be introduced to Ellen on page 7. And this whole paragraph here is going to give us lots of information about who she is. So we see Ellen Crichton and her 9-year-old son, Jethro, were planting potatoes in the half-acre just south of their cabin that morning in mid-April 1861. They were out in the field as soon as breakfast was over. In southern Illinois at that hour was pink with sunrise and swelling redbud and clusters of bloom over the apple orchard across the road. Jethro walked on the warm clods of plowed earth and felt them crumble beneath his feet as he helped his mother carry the tub of potato cuttings they had prepared the night before. So a couple things to pause on. We've been introduced both to Ellen and Jethro. We also have our setting. We have our time. We know now it's April, mid-April, kind of like it is now, but almost 150 years ago, more than 150 years ago, 160 years ago, 1861. And we also know that they are in southern Illinois, and hopefully I'll be able to share some maps with you later on as we look at all of the different places within the Civil War and where battles occur, but where that would be located. We have not really learned much about Ellen and Jethro, other than the fact that we know that Jethro is 9. So let's keep looking for some details about them. I lied about that introduction paragraph. I thought we were going to get to know her better. So this book is tricky because look at how they talk. It's damp fur down on and warm on top. What? So as I read it and we continue on, some of these are going to start to make more sense, which is why I like to read it to you. He remarked, poking a brown hand deep into the soil. Once we get these planted and a soft rain comes, we'll have a crop to make people come up north call us Egypt for sure. So obviously this will have, that they will have a crop. He's talking about their potatoes. They've got lots of them. So the fact that they're called, that's an allusion there referencing Egypt. He filled a burlap pouch with the potato cuttings and hoisted it expertly to his thin shoulder, where a batch of new freckles was just beginning to appear. The world seemed a good place to him that morning, and he felt ready to stride down the length of the field with a firm step and a joke on his lips. "Do you reckon we'll be through by the time ham and cornbread is ready for dinner, Miss Crichton?" he asked. Grinning, he called her Miss Crichton sometimes, as his older brothers did when they teased her. It was just a step from the too bold joke of addressing her by her given name. So keep in mind, this is his mother he is speaking to, calling her Miss Crichton. And if he were ever to call her Ellen in the 1860s, oh, it's not okay. His mother smiled back at him, acknowledging his mood, but she shook her head at his words. "Your hopes is making a fool of your reason, Jeth. We're lucky if these taters is bedded by noon tomorrow." She made short, quick cuts with her hoe in the mellow soil and waited until Jethro placed a cutting, eye upward, and the spot hollowed out for it, after which she raked a covering of soil over it and moved down the long furrow. So the furrow would be the rows where they're planting the potatoes. Here, this is the paragraph I was thinking of. This is Ellen. Make a note. Take some notes. She was a small, spare woman with large, dark eyes and skin as brown and dry as leather. She had been a pretty girl back in the 1830s when she married Matthew Crichton, but prettiness was short-lived among country women of her time. She didn't think much about it anymore, except now and then when Jenny's 14-year-old radiance was especially compelling. Even if she had been concerned, there were reverberations of Calvinism strong within her, which would have protested vigorously against the vanity of regret for a passing beauty. She had borne 12 children, 4 of whom were dead, perhaps 5, for the oldest son had not been heard from since he left for the goldfields of California 12 years before. She had lived through sickness, poverty, and danger for over 30 years. The sight of a pretty face might bring a tired smile to her lips, but it was a thing of value in Ellen's world. So a couple things that I want to point out here. This idea here, comparing the reverberations of Calvinism, always kind of confuses people. That's basically the idea that she doesn't think anything about her vanity. Calvinism was a type of religion at that time, and they were very strict. They did not look in mirrors and that kind of a thing. So she, it's just a thought. And the reverberations is one of our vocabulary words, which I believe I have put in Schoology and hopefully you practiced with yesterday. And the reverberation is the echoing, the hearing those thoughts that your appearance is not important. And although Jenny was introduced in this paragraph, we don't know anything about her yet other than the fact that she's 14. So don't take too much down about her yet, although you could note her age. As we continue into the next paragraph here, here's our answer about Jethro. So make a note, take some notes on what Jethro is like. Jethro was her youngest child, born in the year of 52, a year in which 3 of her children died within 1 week of the dreaded disease they called child's paralysis, a disease which struck the country that year, people said, like the soldiers of Herod. Ellen knew that she favored her youngest son, that she overlooked shortcomings in Jethro for which her older children had been punished. It was a weakness of her advancing years, she supposed, but this was the son who had been spared that summer when children all around were dying of the agonizing sickness. It looked as if somehow destiny had marked him. One didn't talk about such things. The world, she knew, was impatient with women who value their own children too highly. Ellen kept her silence, but saw signs of special talents in Jethro, and she watched over him with a special tenderness. So I want to reference the allusion earlier here where it talks about the soldiers of Herod. So that is an allusion to the Bible that just after Jesus was born, Herod put out an order that all boys under the age of 2 were to be killed. So it was very similar to that. All the boys were wiped out in the time of Herod. And at this time, it's not necessarily just the boys, but children are dying of diseases, of this particular disease, illness, that they don't know what it is. And we'll continue reading, so we'll go back over here. They worked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy his interest as he worked. A south breeze brought the scent of lilacs and sweet fennel to his nostrils and set all the frosty green leaves of a silver poplar tree to trembling. There was a column of wood smoke feathering up from the kitchen chimney, a sign that Jenny was already making preparations for the hearty noon meal. From the neighboring field across the creek, he could hear the shouted commands to the plow horses as Matt Crichton and his 2 older sons got on with the spring plowing. It was a fine morning. Many people around him were troubled, he knew, but that was part of the adult world, which he accepted as a matter of course. Adults were usually troubled. So here's our list of troubles. Ready? This is the answer to number 3 that I said is specific. There were chinch bugs and grasshoppers, months of drought, elections, slavery, secession, talk of war, the adult world of troubles, though was not real enough to dim the goodness of an April morning. So just a quick overview of what some of these troubles are. So bugs and grasshoppers are obviously, they can be a real threat to farmers. And then obviously months of drought, not having water for your plants and that kind of a thing. And remember, this is not like our time period where even though we're trapped in our homes, we can still, well, only one person go to the grocery store, or, order it online and it's delivered to your home, or you get Walmart pickup, whatever it is. But they had to have it on hand. And if they weren't able to grow it, they were out of luck. So obviously those would be worries and troubles at the time. When it mentions elections, and you probably have been hearing things about elections this year, as we're in an election year. The same. This is elections with Lincoln, and I'm not sure who he was running against this first time, but that will come up again in 4 years. Slavery. So slavery was becoming a hot topic at this point. Secession means separating. Okay, so at this time, people were not in agreement over slavery and a couple other topics as well. And some states were leaving the Union. And that's what, whenever we see secession, that's what it's talking about, that they are seceding away from the Union. And for most of it was a pretty easy split as far as South and North. However, there are some border states, and then there were some neutral states for a little while there as well. And Illinois, if I didn't pull up the map for you today, but Illinois is one of those border states, which is what makes this book pretty interesting, is it's not off the bat in the beginning of our book, clearly leaning with Southern or leaning with North. And we'll see that more as it comes along. And excuse me, as I keep kind of checking my phone, I tried to set a timer. We're about halfway through our lesson, but my phone keeps shutting off on me. All right, so we're going to continue down here. I believe we are on leaning towards question 4. You have the answers to 1, 2, and 3. And we're at the spot at about 7 o'clock. A team and wagon pulled out of the barn lot, stopping for a minute before turning into the road, while the driver spoke to a girl who came running out of the kitchen door. Jethro chuckled. Shad's leaving for Newton now. I guess Jenny has to say goodbye, like as if he was going to the North Pole. So we still don't really know these characters yet, but Jenny, we know she's 14. She's in the kitchen and cooking. We don't know who Jethro is, but apparently she really wants to say goodbye to him. And Jethro's joking, like he's going away forever. He watched the wagon from the corner of his eye as he worked, and when the team started coming down the road toward the potato patch, he put the heavy bag of cuttings aside and raced across the field to the roadside. His mother laid down her hoe and followed slowly, picking her way over the mounds of plowed earth that Jethro's feet seemed barely to touch. The young schoolmaster stopped the team and climbed down from the wagon to stand at the fence row, waiting for Jethro and Ellen to come up from the midfield. So I'm just going to double check her questions real quick. Yes, so question 4 was identify Jenny, who we're still kind of trying to get more details on. We know she's cooking in the kitchen. We know that she's 14. We know she's Ellen's daughter. So I guess we have some of those details. Question 5 is who is Shadrach Yale? And if we remember on the page before, Shadrach was the one in the wagon, and he is the one leaving that Jenny ran out to say goodbye to. So as we start this paragraph, they refer to him in a different way, the young schoolmaster. Okay, so that's who's driving the wagon. It is Shadrach Yale, and he is the young schoolmaster. Here's a description as we continue. He was a tall, powerfully built youth of 20, with a firm mouth and grave dark eyes that gave him the appearance of an older man. He had come out from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier to study at McKendree College, where an uncle was professor of natural philosophy, a subject that later generations would call physics. Faced with insufficient funds, meaning he doesn't have enough money, to carry on his studies at the end of his first year, young Yale had turned to the country schools as a stepping stone toward further work in college, and a series of circumstances had led him to the school for which Matt Crichton served as a director. Here he had stayed, not just 1 year as originally planned, but 2, and now in 1861, He had hired himself out as a farmhand to Matt for the summer and contracted to teach still a third term in the fall. He had been stricken with typhoid fever during his first year of teaching, and Ellen Crichton had patiently nursed him back to health with the skills she had learned over the years. There was a strong tie of affection between the two of them. Ellen counted Shadrach as a part of her family and looked after him as she did her own. And Shadrach Yale, in turn, showed a thoughtful courtesy for her that few women of the prairies received from their own sons. There's a lot of information there about Shadrach and who he is. He is not a member of the family, and we saw earlier, Ellen has so many children, but Shadrach is not one of them. He feels like family and lives pretty much on the farm, but not in their house. "Will you be back by supper time?" Jethro called breathlessly as he approached the fence row. At school, he addressed the young teacher as master. But now that Shadrach was so much a member of the family, the necessary formalities of a schoolroom were forgotten. "It's not likely, Jeth. Not before 9 or maybe later." Shadrach smiled at the thin, eager face turned up to him. He was mature enough at 20 to appreciate being a hero to a 9-year-old boy. Beside that, Jethro's quick mind and delight in learning had been a source of pleasure for studious young Yale, who had known the frustration of trying to penetrate the apathy and unconcern of a backwoods classroom. I believe apathy is one of your vocab words too. He had talked to both parents about the promise he recognized in the boy. Matt, in spite of his pleasure, had shaken his head and wondered if the praise for Jethro had not stemmed from interest in Jethro's sister, Jenny. But Ellen had felt no doubts. The praise was in line with what she herself believed firmly. She stood beside the gray rails that morning with her hands folded beneath her apron. Matt had made a pretext of needing supplies from town, but she knew that this trip to Newton in the midst of late planting season would have been unthinkable except for the urgency of getting word from the world beyond their own fields and woods pastures. Her face looked drawn in the bright sunlight. So we're going to talk about that for just a second. I know I'm interrupting the book a lot. That's why I'm doing this lesson. I wouldn't want to leave you to read this on your own and be lost. So 1861, there is no internet. There are no televisions. You do not have the news coming at you from all different directions like we have now. I can pull up my phone. I know what's going on, or I can ignore it. I have that choice as well. Their only form of information in 1861 was the newspapers, or if somebody had sent them information in the mail. And for this particular family to be able to get a newspaper, they have to drive into town, not drive, they have to take the horse and wagon into town. And it tells us later on how far that is, but it takes quite a while for them to travel. They're not close to a big city or anything like that where they can get news quickly. So it's out of the norm for them to be traveling for that. But keeping in mind how slowly news travels during the 1860s, during the Civil War. All right, so we'll continue reading. "I wished there was a telegraph in Newton, Shad," she said. Oh, so to point that one out too, there are no telephones. It's not like you can call someone up. The telegraph, that's when they're typing up the words and they get a little piece of paper as far as what something had said. So the news and information travels very, very slowly. He nodded. "There's one in Olney. They'll send any important news on up to Newton as soon as it comes through. At any rate, I'll bring the latest papers. Seems sometimes there's a deep silence all about us out here waiting to be filled," she said, and she and the young man looked at one another, each pair of eyes dark with anxiety. Jethro kicked a stone in the road. "Sure wished I was going to town with you, Shad," he said finally, because it seemed that someone must say something. "I know. Well, there'll be other trips this summer, Jeff." Shadrach started to climb back into the wagon as he spoke, then changing his mind, he turned back and placed his hands quickly on Ellen's shoulders. "Try not to worry," he said quietly. The caress brought sudden tears to her eyes. She and Jethro stood watching as he drove away. When the wagon disappeared in a clump of trees at a bend in the road, Ellen turned back to her work slowly, as if overwhelmed by a deep weariness. "The Lord knows what news he'll bring back," she said. Oh, I went the wrong way. "There may be war in the land at this minute, for all we know." Jethro was depressed by her somber mood, but not by the imminence of war. So imminence, the fact that it's coming, it's almost unavoidable. He had listened to his brother Tom and their cousin Eb, the two younger of the grown boys in the household, and their excitement had found its way into his blood. Dread of war was a womanly weakness, he had discovered, evidenced by his mother's melancholy and the tears of Jenny and his brother John's wife, Nancy. So we have a lot in this paragraph. I'm just going to double check our questions here. So we have, how did Tom and Eb feel about the prospects of war? Later on, it will ask us about who is Nancy. So we don't have the details there, but it references it as well. So that's what I wanted to check. So Tom is Jethro's brother. Eb would be his cousin. And Eb does live with them. We'll learn more about that later on. So how do they feel about it? We see this idea of excitement, which Jethro has latched onto, unlike the women, which Nancy would be his brother John's wife. And we'll learn more about that. And it's kind of hard to keep track of all of these people. Jethro is going to reference those boys right now in his drawl. "I heard some of the big fellers talking the other night, and they said the war, even if it comes, will be no more than a breakfast spell. They said that soldiers up here can take the South by the britches and make it holler 'nuff' quicker than it takes coffee to cool off for swallowing." Oh my goodness. I don't think we talk like that nowadays, but what did he say? Breakfast spell. It's going to be quick. How quickly do you eat your breakfast? That's how quick they think the war is going to last. They're going to grab them by the britches, by their pants, pick them up and say, they'll have enough, like you're yelling uncle, right? That's enough, stop picking on us, war's over. And they think before your coffee cools off, the war will be over, it's gonna be quick. Now we already know, is that true? Across 5 Aprils, does that seem like a breakfast spell? No. Jethro spoke hurriedly, almost sure that the words would anger his mother and vaguely realizing that he wanted to anger her a little for spoiling the brightness of the morning by her obvious sadness. She had a way of closing her eyes briefly when exasperated, as if to reject for at least a second the existence of a folly that she was bound to recognize later. Her hoe jabbed deeper and more sharply into the brown earth at her feet. "They're foolish young'uns, and they're talking without a spark of reason to guide their words," she said angrily. "It ain't that I don't love 'em, big talk or not," she added, "but I'm fearful for the day when they face their comeuppance. I'm fearful of the time when I'll have no boys left but you and the 3 little ones up on Walnut Hill." It's quite a statement she's just made there. She's afraid of their comeuppance. The time, think about, what does that mean, comeuppance? Usually I have a student who raises their hand and gives me a really great description of what that could be. I bet you are that student right now thinking, oh, or you're that student wishing someone else would explain it to you. So I'll try to put it in my words there. It's a time when you learn that you may have been wrong. It changed, tables have turned on you. So meaning that they are pretty excited for war because they're going to be able to go off and fight. She's afraid they're going to learn the hard way what war really is and what it'll be. That she's going to lose all of her boys, except for Jethro, who's too young to fight. And when she references Walnut Hill, that is where those other babies are buried. So those 3 children that she lost during the paralysis are buried on Walnut Hill. So anytime that is referenced, it's a sad reference. Jethro squirmed inwardly. If there were going to be tears and talk of the children who had died the summer he was born, he wanted to escape. And since one didn't easily escape from his mother in the midst of planting a half-acre of potatoes, he searched hurriedly for a way to turn the conversation. "Did I ever tell you, Ma, of an old feller that give all the people of the earth their comeuppance?" he asked brightly, knowing that she was always proud to hear of the things he'd learned from Shadrach at school. "I reckon you didn't, Jeff, now that I'm able to recollect." Jethro straightened his shoulders a little under the weight upon them. "Well, ma'am, there was a long time when people allowed that the earth was the big kingpin among all the stars and things. They thought that the moon and sun and all the stars went round the earth and maybe kind of tipped their hats as they went by. Shad says that most everybody went on believing that for years, till finally there came along this man I'm telling you about. He was head and shoulders smarter than the run of the mill, and after he'd watched the sun and moon and stars for a long time, he sat down and done some figuring. Well, when he got through figuring, he showed it to some other fellers, and there it was, plain as anything. The earth wasn't the big kingpin at all. He allowed it was just a little star chasing around the sun with a pack of others, some of them a lot bigger than us. Shad says that some folks took that news real hard and kind of let the wind out of their sails all of a sudden. That ain't in the scriptures, is it, Jeff? I don't reckon so, but it's in one of the books Shad brought out from Philadelphia. His mother looked thoughtful. The good Lord God created the earth and all upon it, Jeff. I don't like to hear that his work weren't of the best. But don't you see, Ma? He created the sun and moon and stars too. Some a little bigger, others maybe a little prettier. Seems like people on earth believed we had the best diggins just because we wanted to believe that, because it made us feel important. You ain't watching to keep the tater eyes facing up, Jeff, Ellen said quietly, pointing with the tip of her hoe. He stooped and turned to cutting over. Guess I kind of got carried away with my own noise, he said, flushing. Her eyes lighted a little. Well, you done me a favor. Telling me things I ain't never learned and giving me something to ponder over. It mazes me, Jeff. It does, for a fact, the way you can recollect all the things Shad tells you and how you can put them from his way of talking into mine. She hoed in silence for a minute and then paid him the great compliment of going back to his story. Did you tell me what that old feller's name was? The one that done the figuring? His name was Copernicus. I can even spell it for you if you're a mind. Shad made me learn how to say it and spell it too. Sounds like a furriner. What's a furriner? Foreigner, right? We're going to see some prejudices in here. Jethro nodded. I allow, he agreed. Ellen sighed. Seems like furriners is always stirring up something. Well, the pot can't call the kettle black. Look what we're stirring up amongst ourselves. Oh no, she's turned it back to the Civil War. That's where we're going to stop for today. I have a feeling that I'm a little over half an hour. I wanted to finish those 2 pages and finish a topic. So I'm going to leave you with what I would like you to finish for homework today. If we go back to those study guide questions, we have covered up to number 6. So if you would make sure that you take the time to either write out or type out complete sentences, please put a heading at the top of your paper. Make sure that you date it so that I know when it was, that you have your first and last name on there. Remember, you must use complete sentences. I'm not sure what sort of file I'm going to upload it to, but if you're able to type onto this file, make sure that you leave some space and that you have complete sentences. Do not just bullet the notes. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. I will see you tomorrow for the conclusion of chapter 1. And I'll see you later.